So very good evening to one and all, and good morning to our invited speakers. So very good evening to one and all the participants, the keynote speakers. So myself, Seema Pathak, I am a deputy librarian at IISR, Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Bhopal. And MPLA, it's a privilege of MPLA and it's a privilege of mine to welcome you all here. So today we have a keynote speaker, uh, Tara Murray. He is president of the Specialized Association USA, and is going to give a talk on libraries and resiliency in times of crisis, COVID-19 and beyond. And Seema Rampersad, he is manager of British Library, and Eugene, he is fellow specialist at Dentons, so they will join Tara Murray for this presentation. We also have a president MPLA, Dr. Prabhat Pandey with us, and we have a Dr. P.K. Jain, librarian IAG, and director SLA. And he is going to chair the session of today. With these words, thank you once again, and I welcome our honorable president, MPLA, Madhya Pradesh Library Association, Dr. Prabhat Pandey, to give the welcome address. Dr. Prabhat, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Pathak. And good evening, all of you. I welcome esteemed delegate and guest in today MPLA webinar 19th session. This is our honor and privilege to host MPLA 19th webinar on libraries and librarianship in times of crisis, COVID-19 and beyond. I take this opportunity to welcome our esteemed chairperson of today's session, Dr. P.K. Jain, Librarian IEG Delhi, and Director, Special Library Association. I would like to welcome today's keynote speaker, Tara Murray, President, Special Library Association, USA. And I would like to welcome our special guest, Seema Rampersad, Chair SLA Task Force on Reopening Specialized Libraries, and also President SLA Europe and Senior Business Research and Service Manager, the British Library. Our another special guest, eminent LIS scholar, Eugene Giudice. He is Chair SLA Workplace and Response Advisory Council, Senior Research Service Training Specialist, Dentons. So, friends, as you know, in epidemic and during COVID-19 pandemic situation, when information outbreak is enormous, it is the time to remind the society of the importance of libraries and the role of librarians in organizing and disseminating the information. Accurate information is the key to handle the chaotic situation. Exchange of false information seems to be on the rise. It has created a situation of infomedic, as stated by DG WHO. This has not only affected research work severely, but has also created chaos among lay people. Libraries and publishers have collaborated with leading publishers. They have spontaneously opened up their material to general public and to bridge the digital divide. Several thousands high quality journals are being made accessible directly from publisher websites as well as libraries. Some of the purpose of library is to preserve and transmit recorded knowledge. Libraries and librarians are inseparable from the society in which they serve and society in which they live. This is library in a pandemic is indispensable. All libraries need to develop comprehensive emergency plan with clear, constant, and concise policy and procure for staff. With these words, I handed over the session to Dr. P.K. Jain for further proceedings. Over to Dr. P.K. Jain. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prabhat Pandey, President MPLA, speakers of today's webinar, MPLA team and participants. Good evening to all of you and good morning to our US speakers. I am thankful to MPLA for giving me this opportunity to chair this international webinar. Today we have Ms. Tara Murray as keynote speaker with us, who is speaking on libraries and librarianship in times of crisis, COVID-19 and beyond. We also have two more guest speakers, Ms. Seema Rampersad. She chair SLA Task Force on Reopening Specialized Library and also President SLA Europe. She is also Senior Business Research and Service Manager, British Library, UK. The another special speaker is Eugene Giudice, Chair SLA Workplace and Response Advisory Council, and also Senior Research Service Training Specialist, Dentons, USA. The topic of the international webinar, Libraries and Librarians in Times of Crisis, COVID-19 and Beyond, is the need of current time, and we are moving into a new world environment. The time has come when we need to make changes in the libraries and how the library professionals need to be changed. There are few tips which are all library professionals should follow in the current situation of COVID-19. Number one, we all need to follow the guidelines of our country's government to follow the COVID-19 standard operating procedures, SOPs. The SOPs relating to libraries should be strictly adhered to. The Library Association should come forward to help the libraries with the guidelines to follow the new framework for the libraries. SLA is already doing in this field. In relation to general practice, we should promote the e-resources, digital documents in current area and should avoid the paper copy. We should promote remote access of e-resources so that faculty, researchers, students and users can access from anywhere and from their home. With these few sessions, now I request to our keynote speaker, Tara Murray, for her presentation. Tara Murray is the librarian for Germanic and Slavic language and literatures at Penn State. She previously served as the Director of Information Services and Librarian for the American Palatic Research Library in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, the world's largest library dedicated to stamp collection and postal history, where she oversaw the renovation of new space for the library and developed the library's first digital collection. She also previously served as the Information Corps Director for Penn State's Population Research Unit and has experience in public and corporate libraries. She has an MLIs from the University of Pittsburgh and BA in German Studies from Bard College. Tara was recognized as Fellow of the Special Libraries Association in 2017 and is currently President of SLA. Ms. Tara is giving presentation from US very early morning as present time in the US is 8 a.m. Special thanks to her. Ms. Seema Prasad is the chair SLA Task Force on Reopening Specialized Libraries and also President SLA Europe and Senior Business Research and Service Managers, the British Library UK. Eugene Giudice is chair SLA Workforce Council, that is the PREP. and also Senior Research Service Training Specialist, Dentons, USA. Now I invite Tara More, Ms. Seema Prasad, and Eugene Giudice for their presentation. Tara More, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Pratak. Thank you, Dr. Pandey, and thank you, Dr. Jain, for your introductions and for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very happy to be here today and happy to wake up early for this. So good evening to everyone and welcome. So Eugene, Seema, and I are going to discuss today how libraries and librarians respond to crisis. And we're going to talk a little bit about crisis in general, but of course, we're all very focused on the COVID-19 pandemic right now, so we will focus on that. Of course, we bring our own perspectives, myself and Eugene coming from the United States, and Seema from the UK. But we hope that our experiences will provide something useful that you can apply to your own experience as well. And following the presentation, we look forward to your questions. So in case anyone isn't familiar, I thought I would say a few words about the Special Libraries Association, which is the association that Eugene, Seema, and I all work together in. It is a nonprofit global organization and has a chapter SLA Asia, and PK Jain is on the SLA Board of Directors along with myself. It is an organization for information professionals and our strategic partners in business, government, academic, and other specialized settings. So if you manage information or knowledge resources for organizations and their stakeholders, such as business executives, a government agency, university faculty and students, association members, nonprofit funders, and law firm partners, SLA can be your professional home. SLA promotes and strengthens its members through learning, networking, and community building initiatives, all things that are very important right now, as we are all discovering. So SLA has pivoted to providing all of these opportunities virtually during COVID-19. And I know that Dr. Jain gave a very thorough introduction, but I just wanted to say a little bit more about where I'm coming from, where I'm situated. So currently, I am an academic librarian at Penn State, and this is a picture of the library that I usually work in, except of course now I'm working from home. I specialize in Germanic and Slavic languages and linguistics. Prior to coming to Penn State, about 2.5 years ago, I have extensive experience in specialized libraries. As Dr. Jain mentioned, the American Philatelic Research Library and the Population Research Institute here at Penn State. I have been working here at home since late March. And for the first 3 months that I was working from home, I had to rely on a cell phone for my only internet connection because there is no broadband in my area. At the beginning of this month, I was finally able to get real internet access, which has greatly improved my working at home environment. So that's just a little bit about the perspective that I personally am bringing to this discussion. And I wanted to start off by giving a little bit of overview of the kinds of crisis that libraries and librarians have responded to, because I think for as long as libraries have been in existence, we have always dealt with crisis in one form or another. So the first kind of crisis, the most immediate perhaps for a library, is a crisis located in and directly affecting the library. So for example, what we're seeing in this photo here is a burst pipe that caused a flood in the library. This is in California. And you can see emergency workers helping to clean up the water damage in the library. So in this kind of crisis, it's very centered in the library, and the library may pull in community resources, of course, for immediate cleanup, but perhaps also to raise funds to help with recovery efforts. Another kind of crisis that might affect a library is a crisis in the community. So perhaps one that doesn't affect the library and its staff and services directly, but will affect it indirectly. So for example, in this photo, we're seeing the aftermath of tornado damage in a community. In this case, the tables might be turned from the previous example, and the library might reach out and assist the community, perhaps serving as a shelter, providing internet access, and emergency information and assistance. Then another kind of crisis is one that affects both the community and the library simultaneously. These are historical photos of the Johnstown flood here in Pennsylvania, which decimated the entire town. In a situation like this, resources will be needed from outside the community. So from outside the library and outside the direct local community. But in this case, the crisis is still fairly localized and is not affecting, for example, the entire country or the entire world. And then we have a third kind of crisis, or a fourth kind of crisis, sorry, which is what we're experiencing now, a truly global crisis that affects us all in some way or another. And we are all in this together, of course. And I've heard people use the expression that we are all in the same boat, but it is becoming quite clear that we are not all in the same boat. We are all in the same storm, but we are all in very different boats. We all have very different resources and different experiences that are helping us weather this storm. So at this point, I want to pause and introduce my colleague, Eugene Giudice, who is chair of the SLA Workplace Preparedness and Response Advisory Council, otherwise known as PrEP. And his council has been in existence for quite some time and has collected information about how libraries and librarians have responded to various kinds of crises. So he is going to talk briefly about that. So go ahead, Eugene. Eugene, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yes, Tara, go ahead.
There we go. Thank you, Tara. Can everyone hear me now?
Sound good, Eugene.
Thank you. Dr. Pandey, Dr. Jain, I'd like to thank you and the rest of the Library Association for your warm welcome and your greeting. Before I move into my formal comments, I just want to make a statement or a comment about my own background. Before I came into librarianship, I worked in civil defense as a volunteer. So I have worked many types of incidents, fire, flood, broken water mains, in the locality where I lived at that time. And one of the things that is paramount to understand is that when faced with any type of crisis, the human response has one of two options: fight or flight. And we as information professionals and librarians, we have an opportunity now to really stand together and fight and really try to provide continuity of service to our various constituencies. Now, in this time of pandemic, providing continuity of service is no trivial matter. Some of the issues that we are facing in providing continuity of service is, the first point is, next slide, please. Being able to provide reference. Reference is the stock and trade of what we do as information professionals. So our ability to do that is going to be key for not only the short term, but also the long term viability of our organization and the service to the constituencies that we serve. Next slide, please. The next thing is ancillary services. For example, interlibrary loan. How are we going to be able to provide those materials that may not lie in the collections in our own libraries to both our constituencies, and how are we going to be able to make the materials that we lend out, how are we going to make those available to others? I give you one example. One good example is at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., they have set up a protocol for handling interlibrary loan. When an interlibrary loan is received, when the actual book or the treatise or whatever is coming in is received, it's placed aside for 3 days. No one touches that item for 3 days. Once the 3 days have passed, it then is sent on to the requester. When things go out to be returned from interlibrary loan, again, those things are set aside for 3 days, and then they are sent forward. Next slide, please. The next thing we have to be concerned about are materials not necessarily coming in through interlibrary loan, but things that are coming in from the vendors that serve us, books, loose leaf services, newspapers. These things must be accounted for and tended to during the response to crisis. I'll give you an example. In all of the offices of my law firm, various newspapers are delivered. Well, nobody's in the office to receive those newspapers or to pass them out or anything like that. So what happens to them? We've had to go through and manually contact these newspaper providers and tell them to halt the newspapers. In addition, on top of that is not only are we calling them, but there are other offices, other businesses. They're all calling because no one's in the offices in the downtown areas in the major cities in the U.S. Contracts. How are contracts going to be impacted by COVID-19? I have colleagues, one of which works in our Denver office, and she has to go in literally every 2 weeks just to handle the mail, the incoming product that is being delivered to the firm. This is also bringing into sharp focus the need and the reduction that is happening in many law firms with the reduction of print collections. Attorneys, some of them are very particular about how they receive their legal information. They want their books. Well, there's no way that we can provide those books. So now it's bringing into question how large do the print collections really need to be? Next slide, please. And then finally, scheduling. Scheduling has many layers to it. The first one is simply the scheduling of human beings, people who can provide service in whatever locality they're in. And it's going to be dependent on those individuals and their own personal response to the pandemic, to whatever crisis there is. How can you have people working or ask them to come in to provide service when they're probably thinking about in the back of their minds what's going on at home? And this, we'll be talking a little bit more about resiliency a little bit further along in my talk, but again, scheduling and also scheduling of people to actually enter the building. In my building, I work in the Willis Tower, which is the tallest building in Chicago. And my library, my office is on the 60th floor. One has to make an appointment to actually get in. One has to get permission from not only my firm's management, but also the building management. So there's multiple layers of who can access, who will be able to access, on what schedule, etc. We only have a core team of individuals that go in daily, and that core team is rotated on a weekly basis. So scheduling of individuals and also scheduling just general access to facilities is also going to be impacted and has to be considered when considering response. Next slide, please. What are some of the practical implications of an effective response to a disaster, pandemic, or crisis? Well, the first is individuals need to be ready to assume different roles in their organization. For example, I was on a webinar this week on this very topic with the American Association of Law Libraries, and one of the court librarians, so this is a librarian that supports operations in a federal courthouse in St. Louis. She said quite openly that she no longer is just a librarian or just the head of research services for that court. She is now acting as a de facto assistant counsel to that court in keeping the court functioning. Court functions still have to continue. So we have to be thinking about that. I myself have had to take on different roles. In the US, some of you might be familiar with the notary process, where a person will validate the signature in person on a document and stamp the document and sign the document properly. We can't meet to do those notary duties, so we have to now set up virtual or notaries via Zoom. I have been called upon to do some of these notarial type of actions. So we all have to be flexible and amenable to taking on different roles. Another practical implication is that about planning. Planning is like insurance. You can't get it when you need it. So we need to be thinking about planning of response before the disaster happens. Now, that being said, your disaster plan might be in a binder that's this big. Oftentimes, when the first few minutes of the crisis hits, much of that might not be applicable anymore, and you'll have to sort of run by the what we call here in the U.S. the seat of the pants, or by instinct, or by experience. But it's always good to have that plan available, because it puts you in a mindset of thinking, what do I need to consider? What do I need to have account for? One handy thing is have analog backups of everything. Again, during this webinar that I was attending this week, there was a person was talking about a hurricane and how electrical service was intermittent. So all of their records for contracts, contacts at those vendors, passwords, all of that was electronic. No power, can't access the network, can't access those materials which might be vital in an initial response. So take some value in having analog backups. Make yourself what they call a go bag. In case of an emergency, the go bag will have those, what I call bits and pieces, things that you'll need to have handy right away in your initial response. The next point is make sure people are taking care of themselves. This is one of the things that management is becoming more and more aware of. The fact that how can we provide good service, how can we provide help to our constituencies if people are not, but they can't be present mentally. Let me give you an example. My firm had noticed two during this time of response to COVID-19, and that makes sense, because with everything on lockdown here in the U.S., let's face it, where are you going to go? Okay, it's not that you can get on a plane and go somewhere. They also noted that people were accessing the firm-provided mental health resources that the firms provide, such as Headspace, the Employee Assistance Program. These resources are very important and very useful, but again, management noted that people are accessing these more, so it was important that the firm gather all the staff together and say, we are noticing these two pieces of significant information. Crisis time. The next thing is make use of institutional wisdom. In your libraries, in your information centers, there are individuals who have seen things like this before. Make use of that institutional wisdom to help you in your planning process. It's not necessary to build everything from scratch. There are people who have seen flood in your institution, have seen fire, have seen widespread electrical outages. Take the time to listen to their stories and integrate those stories, those experiences, into your disaster plan. And maybe the last point, maybe the most important point, is we as information professionals should be having a seat at the planning table. When organizations are planning their response to any sort of pandemic, any sort of crisis, we as information professionals should be there, first off, to be the voice of the not only the department or the area that we work in, but also the voice of the constituents that we support. And second of all, who's the expert, as Dr. Patty had noted? Who are the experts? Who are the people best equipped to find quality, vetted information that can go into the planning process? So all of these are, and more, are practical implications of the response to any sort of crisis. Next slide, please. Now, this discussion about resilience, this is the body or the human person's ability to respond, adapt, and move forward in time of crisis. Resilience is not something, again, it's like insurance. You can't get it the moment you need it. This is something that has to be fostered and developed over a long period of time. And there are different types of resilience that are going to be needed in any type of crisis response. Next slide, please. The first is technological resilience. It's impractical and probably not very effective to ask people on Friday, we'll work in the office on Friday, and then Monday, everybody works at home. At our law firm, we had to do a sort of a staged plan of work at home. So we took a few days and we took various offices and we said that in these various offices, on Monday, we want half the people to work at home. On Tuesday, we want the second half to work at home. And this provided a couple of things. It provided, first of all, individuals were able to prepare at their residence for having to work at home, but we also were able to see what the stress on the network was going to be, what was going to have happen in terms of bandwidth for remote access. And these dry runs, these test runs, were a part of that. In addition, now we are having some of our offices are doing trial return to office. So again, it's not effective and not useful to say Friday everybody's working from home, Monday everybody show up at the office. It's not effective, it's not useful, it's not practical. There are other considerations that have to be met. In addition, we are seeing there are more spam attacks or attempted spam attacks. Organizations need to be building into their technical infrastructure a way to resist those attacks. And again, that has to be done over a long period of time. It has to be planned. Next slide, please. Personal resilience. This is what the resources that the person has within them to adapt and to work through a particular crisis. Again, it's not done overnight. So firms have taken steps to provide tools that for individuals to build personal resilience. I spoke about the app on the phone, Headspace. It's an app that people can subscribe to. There are meditation exercises, thoughtful readings. Individuals at this time are encouraged to make use of their own spiritual tools from their own spiritual tradition to build personal resilience. Firms also are providing things like employee assistance programs, and we have been constantly encouraged to make use of those tools, especially now because not only do you have the stress of work at home, but there are also other stressors that are coming into the home. For example, children are not going to school. They're not going to the school building. So how do you manage work at home and have to manage the technology and the attention given to children, school-age children, elder care issues? All of those things can be problematic for individuals, and the development of personal resilience is so important to weather these types of crises. Next slide, please. Interpersonal resilience. What I'm talking about is the relationships that people build and forge have to be nurtured, have to be maintained. In this, especially now during this time when many of us are still what we call sheltering in place, it's so important that we remain connected to the larger community. So how many times do we go on to Zoom calls or webinars just like this, just to connect with human beings, to talk, to, as we say in the US, bitch and moan about our problems. And it's not such a bad thing to do that once in a while, to bitch and moan. It's an acknowledgement that we're under a strain and under some pressure. How are we reaching out not only to our own network of people, but outside of our network of people? How are we reaching out to the constituencies that we serve to let them know that we are there for them and that they in turn can be there for us? So these interpersonal relationships need to be fostered and nurtured. One of the things that I've said to a number of people is this time of crisis is going to be the rise and the fall of many individuals, many organizations. The question now becomes, how are we going to meet this challenge? As Tara said, we're all in the same storm, but it's necessary for us to be able to throw that rope out of my boat into your boat. And that's what's going to keep ourselves healthy, mentally healthy, and ready to continue to provide service to our constituencies now during this time of crisis, but also going forward and in the future. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tara.
Thank you, Eugene. That was a very helpful overview of how libraries have been responding to crisis. So the current crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, began with sudden closures and a very abrupt transition to working remotely for many of us. At the same time, we faced disruptions in our personal and professional lives, and some of these disruptions have included illness for ourselves or for our families, perhaps, financial impacts. Many people have had lost employment or are facing reduced employment. Loss of social structure. We don't have all of the normal in-person, interpersonal connections that we're used to. Loss of access to social services that we rely on. And as Eugene mentioned, the general stress and anxiety of a very uncertain, unpredictable situation. And now many of us are starting to move into the reopening phase. So this photo is from my local public library, which has partially reopened so that people can come in and pick up books and other library materials, but is not yet letting patrons into the public. And this phase, which has allowed for a little more planning than the abrupt shutdown in March and April, is going to be followed by some kind of a new normal. I don't think any of us expect that our library services or our physical spaces will look exactly as they did at the beginning of 2020. So to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about reopening, I would like to introduce my colleague Seema Rampersad, who is chair of SLA's task force on reopening specialized libraries. And she is going to talk about the work that her task force has been doing to look at how libraries around the world have been approaching reopening. So go ahead, Seema, please.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
go ahead.
Thank you. So I am Seema Rampersad. A bit of a background into myself. I'm Asian, Indian looking. That's because I am from the Caribbean. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. My ancestors were from India. So unfortunately, I don't speak Hindi fluently, but I welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am also president of SLA Europe. so which is the European chapter of SLA. So do have a look at our website. I've put our link in the chat box. And we also do some webinars that are free, and you don't have to be a member. So have a look at what's coming up in our events page and our blogs. I also work at the British Library, currently at the Business and IP Centre, which is closed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in one of my slides. As with COVID-19, it's affected all of us. As Eugene and Tara said, some of us have had crisis experience in the past in our careers, and hopefully with all the insights and everything that we have, and also the global community that we have with SLA Europe, we'll be able to share things with you. Next slide, Tara. So the task force was set up by Tara to actually look at reopening Specialised Library. And if we hadn't set it up in the last month, we should have actually been doing it now. So I'm glad that Tara was ahead of the curve. So it was a need coming out from our community in conversations that we have on our community of practice. And also you can tell by the general community, the library community, that this is something that we should have done, and we are doing it. And I'm glad that it was actually set up in June to this last month. Part of that was actually setting up a roundtable where we got our members to join us and to discuss the issues that we were facing. So things such as, simple things about remote working, closing libraries, curbside. And because of the nature of the virus, some libraries are actually ahead of the curve and some are behind the curve. So actually learning from that and also being able to share experiences was really useful. I myself wasn't aware of things like curbside, which in the picture that Tara showed about her local library is happening at the moment. So being able to come together as a community to share experiences and best practice and insights was really useful. And we've already had that event. So those discussions, we've taken that on board, and we're also going to incorporate that into our task force guidelines. So that's very useful in terms of us using as Eugene said, the institutional knowledge that we've gained over the years in actually physical spaces and providing information services in crisis. But one of the guiding principle in all of this, when we were told very, very abruptly that we had to close libraries, but also it was a slow build up from what was happening in the Far East to what actually eventually happened in Europe and other parts of the world, was the fact that we had to actually be aware of the human element of it. Our libraries are libraries, but the people who go into our libraries are humans, and also the people who work in libraries are humans. So the safety and well-being is the main issue, and it's one of the guiding principles of what we need to address in reopening libraries. Next slide. So in a crisis, as you might have learned when you're doing communication skills, is that you must communicate. So communication. You can't be, you actually need to tell your users, you need to tell your staff, you need to be aware of changes in a crisis because things are moving very fastly, and you might not be able to react as quickly as possible. And one of the key things that happened to us is behind the scene where I work at the British Library, we obviously knew this was a slow build up in COVID-19. From our own personal experience, I'm talking here, is that obviously the library was closed at the end of March. I was actually off that time because it's around my birthday celebration, but being told that we were going to shut, it was all electronically online, the public needed to know. So obviously the library communicated that on their Instagram page and all their digital channels. And also we have actually 4 months on, we're actually hoping to open next week, but it's been a very long drawn out process and discussing everything, all the things that needs to be thought about in terms of the physical spaces, getting to work, commuting, offering services that are the reduced, but also managing expectations of staff and also customers who are going in. So there's lots of things that needs to be said, and you have to really engage with your audience and staff and all the stakeholders that you may have in terms of reopening libraries. Next slide. So the work of the task force has already started, and some of it is actually quite detailed that I can't share everything with you today. So what I've done, I've actually created a very quick snapshot of the SWOT analysis of what we're facing in this crisis. So some of the common themes are strengths. So in the library community, this has given us an opportunity to become more digital. Some of you might have seen the social media share where they're saying what has actually created the social digital transformation that we need, not some tech or some CEO, but COVID-19 have actually made us become more digitally transformed. So, and even within the department where I work, we've been able to implement new things that we weren't able to try before. We've actually, I'm impressed with my colleagues at the British Library. We've impressed a new reference system using LibAnswers. So these are things that, you know, we're able to do. So it's new and digital services. Everybody knows about Zoom. This is the first time I'm using Cisco's WebEx. So it's all new to me as well. And the new technologies that, you know, we might not have tried, we're using them. So those are the strengths. The weaknesses, obviously, is accessibility. All the things that Eugene and Tara have already mentioned in terms of the digital access and things like broadband, access to computers, access to customers. I mean, we have customers who usually come in who don't have internet access at home. They come to the library to use books, and they come to the library to use technology, or they come to the library as a space. So all of those things we've lost in COVID-19, and also the physical events that have, the coming together of people and communities to discuss things, and actually to actually share knowledge and share information and just be in a space. So those are some of the things we've lost in COVID-19, and also the commercial aspects of physical events, you know, the things that we charge for, or sort of the cultural benefits that we may have. That's one of the things COVID-19 doesn't allow us to do in a physical space. But there are opportunities. So you can, you know, we've had to change and adapt new ways of delivery. Obviously, that's something that's enabled by technology or various things. We obviously can't meet in persons as we could, but there are opportunities there. It's been a great time as well to do your CPD, your continuous professional development, with courses that are available free, and the time that you have to do those in COVID-19. And also, it's a great way of actually advocating for the library. You know, as Jain, Dr. PK Jain has said, the role of the library, and Dr. Pandey has said that the role of the library is really essential in this time, and we should really be shouting at the opportunities in terms of what we have for the future as well. But in all of this, there are threats. So our physical collections are locked into libraries and physical spaces. We can't access them. And that's the beauty of being in the library community. You have physical as well as digital, and we have the best of both worlds. So those things are obviously, with things locked into physical spaces, you can't access them. There's also overheads in terms of like building spaces and rents and things like that. So your budgets might end up being cut. Your staff might end up being cut because, you know, budget reductions and things like that. So there are lots of issues and threats there in coming across. Also, you mightn't be using something, so your whoever's in charge of your budget might say, well, we can get rid of that. So in terms of like resources that you have in the collections, you need to be aware of that. But also staff and customer well-being, as I said, is the main thing. So it's really important that you actually build that into your planning. Staff needs to be their well-being, and as Eugene said, their really resilience mentally but physically, and their lack of their anxieties and everything needs to be aware of. And also, we're not engaging so much in person with our customers, but things like social media and the digital channels that we have are some of the things that we could actually use to maintain the well-being of our customers. Next slide, please. So in reality, some libraries, as I said, there's a return to opening happening. Some libraries are ahead of the curve and some are not. So the reality of opening is engaging with your community, finding out what needs to be done and how they're responding to it. Are they going to actually come into the library, knowing that COVID might still be quite prevalent in your communities? So you need to think about those sort of things in terms of your communities. Oops. So and also your staff and customers, I said, put that in your radar in terms of are they able to come back. We're also looking to seek and share best practice with other libraries. And we're a global industry, we're a global community of information professionals, and people are sharing things online. So have a look at that and learn from other people. And the issues might range from small things to very large things. So some of the small things that I heard this week, and which is very obvious, is things like people going into the library to use their toilets or washroom, as you may say, or lavatories. So little things like that, access to physical spaces, to very large things such as digital collections and access and the negotiations of digital assets and things like that. So the range of topics that we need to look at in reopening libraries are very, very sparse, but coming together as a community is very useful. One of the key things as well is also to look at stages of reopening. You can't just go, you need to think about what are the risks involved, so also building in that element of risk, and obviously offering a phase opening which allow you to actually deal with those risks in time in a crisis. You don't need to do them all at once. Obviously you test and adapt to the challenges that are there and learn from them. And obviously things are not going to be totally normal in the new normal, but also having the confidence that some things do work and some things you're actually still trying to get right. The photograph on this page is actually from the library. It's called the London Library, and just some of the things and the signages are there that are showing you that what's going to be the new normal in the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide. So the practicalities, I think, personally, the British Library hasn't opened its physical space as yet. We're hoping to open next week. I'm actually going to be in phase one. I'm actually still going to continue working from home. In terms of that, the library's always been open. We've continued doing services from home. I mean, I do clinics, I do webinars, I do reference work, meetings, everything from working from home. But in terms of the physical space, obviously you need to think about social distancing. There's lots of topics in terms of like deep cleaning of equipment and spaces, perfect screen and PPE for staff, protecting them. That's the new normal now, and that's happening everywhere in some of the libraries I've looked at. You also need to build in your risk assessment in terms of like how is it going to affect people, but also any sort of like in terms of a second wave, what's going to happen. Do you need to shut down very quickly? You need to protect these people. So in terms of like building teams of bubble, if you have a large team, making sure that if an infection starts again, you'll be able to just treat the problem in bubbles and in teams, but also be prepared for the unexpected. I don't think I've mentioned it there, but a big part of one of the issues in terms of going back to work is actually traveling and commuting. So that needs to be built in. Not all of us can actually walk to our office or walk to the library. So we don't know how that's going to happen once there's going to be a gradual return to normal. So some libraries are actually closed for a longer period. Hildy, who's in New York and SLA member, and also a part of the task force with me, she said that their library is not going to be open for a very long time, and she actually wants to go in, but it's been made a decision that it's not going to happen for a long time. So some libraries are opening more right now, and some are not. Some are actually taking the opportunity to delay things until things are more clear. But the main thing is to keep that connection and engagement with your communities, from externally, as Tara mentioned, but internally, staff, and make sure that things are there in terms of the change management side of what you need to do. The photos I have are some of the things pre-COVID-19. So just before I left the office, the sanitizer was being seen across my the physical spaces in the library. I haven't been to my local library as yet. I'm hoping to, but in terms of getting used to social distancing guidelines, and that's the new normal. And one of the key things was for me was in February, I attended a webinar by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And they were highlighting the impact of COVID-19, and it's going to be the world's biggest story. At the time, I myself didn't know it was going to be such a big impact on the world, but it certainly has. And we're having to learn from that experience and actually adopt new ways of working. So next slide. So some of the things I was sharing in the task force was about the sort of, in terms of the knowledge that we have across the organization and the community. So the task force, we're hoping to share guidelines by the next 2 weeks to SLA and our community. Maybe that will be made public eventually. So we're actually working on those things. We're sharing a list of resources and best practice for further information for our own community and learning from that community. And we're discussing some of the insights that I've shared with you today. As I said, it's very high level that I've shared with you today. There's lots of things to consider, and it is very much a very hot topic and big conversation. In terms of the ships and the boats, it's massive. And you might be in a dinghy, but some of the things that you can learn from others is really good. In terms of finding out how we can help each other. But in terms of the task force, we obviously need to be seen as the people who are helping each other within our own library communities. And I'm sure you yourself are learning from this, and you can share with other people, such as Madhya Pradesh Library Association. This is an example of one of the really good posters that's available in Solano County, which is in California in the USA. I thought it was very clear, even some of the things that I wasn't aware of, like having times for seniors only to attend their library session. Obviously, lots of seniors are at risk or more at risk at contacting the virus. So these are some of the things that, that's very quick and clear, and very clear communication for your library users. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide, but I wanted to say that, we're all in this problem together. It is a global phenomenon, the coronavirus, COVID-19, and the task force is actually working as to get those feedback and get those best practice. And we're hoping to come together. We're all in this together. It's a global problem to learn and support each other. The photo on my left is when we had the task force, and it was very engaged. We had 100 people discussing the topic. And the photo on the left is something that I did this week as a member of the British Library. This was the Living Knowledge Network, and we were sharing best practice from Christian, who's based in Denmark, and he's a little bit ahead of the curve. So he was sharing his insights with us. And the main thing is that we're all human, and we're learning from each other. And the library is not closed. It's just very different, and we just have to know what to do next. That's it for me. Thank you very much. And I pass over to Tara now.
Thank you very much, Seema. And I really like that you mentioned a couple of times that the library is not closed. So our physical spaces may be closed or partially closed or restricted, but certainly I think most of us need to provide services to our constituents or our patrons or our clients, and we've continued to move forward on our own internal work as well. So the next phase that we will move into from as we reopen in some capacity is we will start adjusting to some kind of new normal. There will be some kind of long-term planning. And many library leaders are already starting to reimagine what it means to be a library today. I'm seeing increased focus on electronic resources. Seema mentioned that that's one of our strengths. and content providers. Many of the publishers and content providers have provided free or special access during the pandemic, but that's perhaps not going to last into the long term. And I'm seeing that libraries are continuing to think about these big deals that some of us are locked into, and whether that is really the best way to develop robust collections. And I think we're also seeing increased value on human connections, you know, a little bit perhaps counterintuitively as we are all physically separated, but we can see that we are all missing each other and looking forward to connecting and to learning from each other, even though we are having to do it in a virtual environment now. The slide I'm showing is a screenshot of the Georgia Tech Library, which is physically located in Atlanta, Georgia, here in the US. And you see this big red banner that I think we're getting pretty used to seeing on websites, alerting users to the COVID-19 response and changes to services and physical locations. But what is also on this website is something called Library Next. And that is a renewal of the Georgia Tech Library. This was actually begun before the pandemic. So this is not a pandemic response. This is an initiative that was already underway, but it's a renewal and reimagining and redefining of the library, already recognizing before COVID-19 a different relationship with our physical spaces and evolving services to changing research, teaching, and learning needs in this case, because this is a university library. And so this is a little more about the Library Next initiative at Georgia Tech. And it begins even without these, it's talking about limited access to physical collections and relocation of some of the physical collections to an annex facility. Even without these books, we are still a research library. And that's something that we're doing a lot at Penn State as well. Our library serves campuses throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think we have about 30 different locations, but we very much see ourselves as one library and one collection. And that was also pre-pandemic, and I think that will be strengthened post-pandemic as we're learning more and more to work virtually. So going forward, I think we need to expand our scope of what a library is beyond our physical spaces and our in-person programming. And related to this, I think library associations are going to be more critical than ever. Our in-person gatherings are certainly limited now. We've all had to cancel many in-person events, and they may perhaps be changed forever. Are we all going to feel comfortable getting on airplanes, traveling around the world, gathering in large groups in convention centers, eating meals together? I hope that we will, but perhaps it will look a little bit different. And we've all seen that we are able to connect virtually, you know, to SLA Asia and now to the Madhya Pradesh Library Association. I've had conversations with librarians in New Zealand, in Europe. So, you know, there are opportunities in this, even as we are facing immense challenges. We've seen that we're able to present quality professional development in a virtual setting, and that we're able to network. SLA held a virtual half-day event at the end of June called Info Trends. And we had librarians from all over, information professionals from all over gathering, and we were able to sit at virtual tables and connect with each other. And it was a really wonderful experience. So we've been able to share our ideas and our knowledge about what is next for libraries. And I think in the long term, this will strengthen our position. And I wanted to end with this quote from Wanda Brown, who is the immediate past president of the American Library Association here in the US. And she says, libraries are places of learning and connection for all ages and backgrounds. So this crisis has challenged us to work creatively to adapt services while our facilities are closed. From bridging the digital divide to addressing learning loss to aiding job seekers and small businesses. We know library services are essential to campus and community recovery and resilience. So as we have seen in past crises, libraries are very essential to our community. As was mentioned in the introductions, information is absolutely critical in our response to this pandemic and to other crises. People need to know where to look for resources and assistance, and they need to be able to share what they're doing to get them through so that we can all learn from our collective experience. So even as this is a great challenge, and even as some of us are looking at very long-term challenges, so my university is looking at massive budget cuts, restrictions on hiring, changes to our workforce, changes to the way that we do learning for our students. But I think there are also opportunities as we see an increased importance of libraries and really showcasing what libraries can do and emphasizing the human aspect of libraries, which is all of us and all of the people that we work with in our libraries. So that concludes our presentation, and thank you once again to Eugene and to Seema for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. Thank you to all of the attendees today for listening, and I'm seeing lots of great comments in the chat, so thank you for that. I will close with this slide, which gives our email addresses, so you're welcome to contact any of us after the presentation if you have more questions, but I hope that we do have enough time to address some of your questions here today.
Thank you so much, Tara, President SLA, for sharing your expertise and experience with us. We also thank you, Seema Rampersad and Eugene for sharing their views on libraries and librarianship in the time of crisis. So now I request Dr. P.K. Jain, President, Dr. P.K. Jain, who is chairing this session. He is also librarian at IIT Delhi and Director to summarize the session.
Thank you very much, Tara More, Eugene, Giudice, Seema Rampersad, for such a wonderful and informative presentation. Tara More discussed crisis in the community and library and global crisis very well. Eugene discussed service impact, practical implications, type of resilience needed. Very wonderful presentation. Seema Rampersad discussed about the libraries reopening after COVID-19. That is a very important issue nowadays. She also discussed about the SLA task force for reopening specialized libraries. All the participants are very happy for these presentations. Now I invite Dr. Sandeep Pathak for question session. Dr. Sandeep Pathak, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. So there is one question from Dr. Navi Hassan. That the question is that what is the response of the publishers there for the next year subscription? Like while they declared that there will be no price increase. Secondly, what especially are the gains there in UK while working from home? So this question is for Tara Mule.
Oh, sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you either repeat that, or maybe could somebody type it into the chat?
Sure. So the first question is that what is the response of the publisher there in USA for the next year subscription? Like Wiley declared that there will be no price increase.
Okay, I'm still having a little trouble hearing, but I did hear that the question is about what has been the response of publishers in the US.
Yeah, publishers pricing for next subscription year.
Okay, so what we saw initially was that most publishers have been very eager to provide resources and emergency assistance during the pandemic. So, you know, for example, many publishers opened up journals that we would not normally have access to, or provided temporary access to databases, which was very helpful as we were, you know, here at my institution, we were in the middle of the semester, classes were still ongoing, switched very suddenly to remote, and we were getting lots of frantic questions from students, how could they access their textbooks, and from instructors about how they could provide materials to their classes, such as videos and other materials that they would use in their instruction. And publishers and places like the Hadi Trust, which is a big partnership for digitization, really opened up access. But I think, long term, that's not going to be a solution. Publishers are just not going to make their content available for free, for the foreseeable future. So as we adjust to, as I said, some kind of new normal, I think we're going to need to negotiate with the publishers and the content providers. I know most of us here in the US, and I would imagine in a lot of places, are facing reduced collections budget. My library has been working on making pretty drastic cuts to our journal subscriptions and to our book collection efforts. So we're really needing to think about what the priorities are of a local collection versus what we can do in terms of collaborative collection development, working with other universities. So as I said, I think, we need to take a long, hard look at what our relationship with publishers and content providers is. Certainly they are our partners. I don't see them as the enemy. There are a few that I think have not perhaps treated libraries as much like equal partners as they could. But I think for the most part, these are our partners, and we all exist in the same ecosystem. We all need each other to survive. But I think we're not going to be able to go back to collection development the way it was. Certainly we realize that access to print collections can be precarious and that we need remote access to our electronic collections. So I hope that partially answers your question, and Eugene or Seema, feel free to chime in if I missed anything that you're aware of.
Thank you so much. There is one more question. It's to whom it is not clear, so any one of you may answer this question. The question is from Dr. Neeraj.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that question. I work in a law firm, and in the U.S., we've seen a great consolidation in legal publishing. One of our vendors, we were in negotiations with right up in the middle of this pandemic crisis, and we're finding it's been our experience. It's different than Tara's because Tara works in an educational institution. There's been a hardening of the line in terms of demanding price increases. Also, our attempt to reduce our print collection has sometimes been thwarted because of the fact that the publisher will say, okay, if you want access to the online version of such and such, you have to buy so much in print, or else they make the cost of going standalone online service so prohibitive that you end up having to buy the print just to avoid the huge cost increase. So I think the dynamic is a little different for educational institutions and possibly nonprofits than it would be for a for-profit institution, and especially law firms in the U.S. Again, we are also thinking about collection development and the reduction of print collections. But again, sometimes that's difficult given the line that many of the publishers are taking, the legal publishers are taking with regard to online access.
From my point of view is that we obviously are a national library, so there are issues with access normally where we only give access to people who are in our reading rooms, or if there's a contract to commission us to do research or things like that. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, there aren't issues with regards to cost and getting content free, because our contracts are sort of like built into like long periods of 3 years and so on. But obviously, a lot of it is locked into the library and we can't access at the moment. So there will probably be some negotiation going on afterwards about what happened to that period where we were closed. I think we've only had one decision for my department, because it's a very large library in terms of like cutting budgets, but for one resource, but because it's built into long-term contracts. But yes, we've had to adapt our access issues because people expect to access everything remotely, and we can't offer that as a national library, and we also have an international audience, so that works in favor against us in terms of dealing with suppliers and content providers.
Thank you so much. Can I take another question?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So the next question is that what big change you see once this COVID-19 is over and users start coming to the library? I'll repeat the question. What big change you see once COVID-19 is over and users start coming to the library?
Okay, yes, good question. And I think perhaps it's a little hard for any of us to say for sure what our libraries will look like after COVID-19 is over. But I do, there is evidence from other pandemics that it has, it made significant and long-lasting changes to things that we do in our society. I think it's worth remembering that at one time surgeons did not routinely wash their hands, and now we would expect that every surgeon would thoroughly wash their hands, at standard intervals and before and after doing certain things, that our food handlers would do that. So I think there will be things like that are new to us now, but will perhaps be just become part of our standard procedure, and 50 or 100 years from now no one will think twice about them. So perhaps we don't put as many people in a physical classroom as we used to, or we don't have the same number of people working in an office, or perhaps we rethink some of the open and shared office plans that, at least here in the US, were very popular for a while and are now seeming like not such a good idea. I don't know, Seema, if you want to add anything from what your task force has been looking at.
Yes, I think the main thing in going forward in terms of reopening the libraries is that we can go ahead with the new normal, and obviously there'll be adjustments and new ways of working in terms of space planning, hygiene, also the whole human well-being things, and also collections. But also I think learning from this experience, and for those of us, I think Eugene might have had experience, and also yourselves in cities, is that we've had disruption in the past, we've had crises in the past. So one of the main things, I actually used to work at the Greater London Authority, which is the City Hall in London, and one of the things I learned from that experience is also having a business contingency planning. For, so in terms of being prepared going forward, what did you learn from this experience? What do you need to change to to happen in the future if it should happen again? So little things, obviously, with managing your staff, but also being able to, how do you access collection? I know I've been working from home for a number of years, like 15 years when I can. So I used to always send my emails to access certain things to my personal email, which is on the screen, because I knew one day I might need to access this from home because of a working from home experience. If you live in a big city like I do in London, there are crises that might happen. There might be something on the train, a bomb or terrorist attack. So where you can't physically go into the library, or flooding, or various things. So I think being prepared in the new normal, of expecting that things are never going to be always perfect, and you have to be able to access your resources and manage your staff and communicate with your community. And that's something I've learned, and I think definitely the business contingency planning will be one of the recommendations that we will have going forward.
From my experience, what I think we're going to see happening, it's not necessarily a reopening of the library, but a reimagination of, as Tara said, workspace writ large. In many law firms, they are locked into long-term leases for very pricey real estate in large office blocks in various cities. We're going to be seeing a lot of those being either renegotiated, attempts to sublet space, or when those leases come due. Now, those leases are oftentimes, sometimes 10, 15 years long, that firms will be making reductions in space in general. So the work at home experience is going to become more of the norm than the exception in large law firms. And the concomitant with that is the fact that I think attorneys are going to become more reliant on information professionals, because they will not have the things at their hand like they did back in the office. They're going to be relying on us to provide them the access and the materials that they need in electronic format. So we're going to be seeing, again, a greater push towards electronic and a reduction in print resources.
Thank you so much. And now I'll take there are a lot of questions. I'll take the one last question. The question is from Dr. Neeraj Chaurasia, that how is the pandemic is going to affect the collection development in the librarian or the librarian basically. Your opinion, please. Again, I repeat the question. How is the pandemic is going to affect the collection development in library? Your opinion.
Yep. Thank you. That's a good question about how the pandemic will affect collection development. Certainly, as I think both Eugene and Seema have said, right now we're increasingly relying on electronic resources, and I think that trend is going to continue. I think we're going to need to think a lot more about remote access to our collections and how we provide that and who we provide that to. So, for example, at Penn State, we can only provide access to a lot of our electronic resources to faculty, students, and staff who are currently affiliated with the university. And we're all now also having to navigate providing access to those collections to people who may be located all over the world and in very different kinds of situations. So, for example, a lot of especially our international students coming from outside the U.S. are now all in their home countries. So we are dealing with different levels of internet access, and even here in the US, different levels of access to internet, as I've seen in my own experience with not having good internet access at home. But then also dealing with resources that might be censored in other countries or not available for license. I deal a lot with film and streaming video in my job, and the licenses are different in different countries. So what we can provide to a student here in the US might be different from what we can provide to a student in Italy or a student in South Korea. So there are lots of issues. I don't think print collections are going away. That we've heard people say, for years and years and years, oh, the book is dead, the book is dying. It's not. We all know that it's impossible to just digitize everything and make it searchable and accessible and available. That's certainly a monumental task. But I think we're increasingly relying on electronic resources. And I think we need to think about the licenses that we're signing. Much of this electronic content we don't own. We license, and there may be restrictions over and above the restrictions of copyright on how we can use it. We've seen that in a lot of ways that instructors are not able to use streaming video in the same way that they would use a DVD or a VHS tape in their instruction. So I think libraries are going to need to push back on some of that, and also to band together and work collectively rather than trying to do this all on our own. And I think that's for any kind of library, for public libraries, for academic libraries, for government and corporate libraries, and nonprofit libraries.
Thank you.
Yes, I was going to add that going forward, I think obviously the things that we've learned is obviously equipment. There's various level of equipment. Some people didn't have access to laptops, some even members of our team at home, or various equipment. So also thinking about that post COVID-19, having equipment registered to our contracts. And the other thing that was an issue in terms of access is obviously IP addresses in terms of the electronic resources. The electronic resources are built into the physical space of where I work, but in terms of the being able to access them on your own device, I'm coming to you for my own computer at home, so I can't access some of the resources at home. So I think in the future, being able to build in those things into the contract in terms of offering access to staff in sort of business contingency way, it's very useful as well. And I agree with Tara, we still need the physical spaces and physical access to books and collections, and the library community doesn't just focus on what's current, it focuses on archives and various sort of digital assets that sits in collections everywhere and museums and things like that. So the cultural aspect and the physical aspects, as well as, sometimes the books are too big and legal firms and documents, and people do want that physical space. So learning from those things about how we can access those areas in the future is really useful as well. And I think there will be a move towards online learning for other things. I mean, webinars are great for like quick, snappy things, but a more move to learning, as you said, Tara said, some of our students are abroad, and actually building those sort of global aspects as well in terms of the region and where you're accessing information is really important going forward.
One other aspect that I think needs also to be considered is the infrastructure that each institution has. For example, when I came on this call this morning, my laptop was connected through to my firm through the VPN. I couldn't access the website for this webinar while I was connected to the VPN. So I had to disconnect from the VPN and then connect to the webinar. So I think because we're becoming a more globalized sort of flow of information, the things that corporations are going to let through their firewall are also going to be going to have to change. And this pandemic is really, as Tara and Seema has mentioned, has really shined a bright light on the digital divide that not only is in our countries, but is in the world in general. And I think those aspects also are going to have to be addressed for us to really provide the high quality research and reference services that our constituents and patrons have to know.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, what is the now and this current scenario in our Indian context? I'll just update you all. Like in India, all our academic institutions, they were actually closed in the third week of March, and they were fully closed till May 31st. So of course, all the libraries physical space were closed. Though we are, libraries are on because we have a content online, and due to this remote login access software, all the academic institutions they are able to fulfill the academic needs of the users. So still in most of the academic institutions in India, now classes are off, but only research is on with the limited number of PhD scholars. And in India, most of the institutions, they have announced that next semester is going to be online mode. And so what we are doing, most of the CFTI, centrally funded institutions, those who are not having ebooks, what we are doing, whatever our existing print book collection, that also for textbooks. So we are now going to convert in the ebook form. Because once we are going to start the session in online mode, it is our duty to make sure that whatever textbook we have prescribed in the syllabus, they are available in the ebook form. So that is what we are at this moment. We all librarians are busy doing this exercise, and of course, as I said, we are having a remote login access and all. So this is how we are fulfilled to academic needs of this our business. So thank you so much once again for giving the answer to these questions. There are still few more questions, but due to time consideration, now I close the session and I request our President, Madhya Pradesh Library Association, Dr. Prabhat Pandey, to give the vote of thanks. Prabhat sir, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sandeep. So, thank you so much, Dr. P.K. Jain, Librarian IEG, and Director SLA, for accepting our invitation to chair the session. As you know, Dr. Jain attended 13 SLA conference. He is presently Director SLA Board, President-elect SciTech Division SLA, and Treasurer and past President of the SLA Asian Chapter, and President of Society for Library Professionals. He has received SLA Hall of Fame 2018, SLA Fellow 2015, SLA President Award, SLA DLDP Award, and many awards from B&F Division of SLA. So thank you so much, Dr. P.K. Jain, for accepting our invitation and guiding the LIS professionals. I would like to thank today's keynote speaker, Tara Murray, President, SLA USA, to guide the professional very effectively and discuss all the aspects of what is the role of librarian after COVID-19. So thank you so much, Tara Murray. I would like to thank Seema Rampersad and Eugene Giudice for wonderful presentation, and I would like to thank all three speakers to discuss each and every issue. And I would like to thank Dr. Neeraj Chaurasia, Dr. Naveed Hassan, and all the eminent scholars who joined the session. Last but not least, I would like to thank all the delegates who joined from different parts of the country: Pakistan, Namibia, Nigeria, Africa, UK, USA, etc., etc. So thank you one and all. Thank you. Now I request all the participants, please on your camera for group photograph. Thank you. Thank you one and all. Thank you. Over to Dr. Sandeep Pathak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prabhat, for giving the vote of thanks. Now I'm going to close the meeting. Before I close, I request all the participants to take on your video so we can take one group photograph and then we close the session. So I request all of you, all the participants, please on your video so we can take the group. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much once again, Tara, President SLA, and Seema Rampersad, Eugene Giudice, Dr. Nabi Hassan, Dr. Neeraj, and all the parties. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Dr. Jain. Jain, sir, can I close the session? Thank you so much. I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.